The scream that tore through Josephine Crawford's throat died against the thick wooden walls of the cellar, swallowed by darkness and despair, as she hammered her fists against the locked door until her knuckles bled. 3 days had passed since her stepfather had dragged her down here by her hair, his whiskey breath hot against her face as he'd sworn she would never see another man as long as he controlled her fate. The year was 1878, and in Alamosa, Colorado, a woman without protection was little more than property, especially when the man who claimed authority over her was wealthy enough to make the sheriff look the other way. Josephine pressed her face against the rough wood, her 20-year-old body trembling from cold and hunger. The cellar beneath her stepfather's ranch house was damp and smelled of earth and rot. A single bucket in the corner served as her only facility, and the blanket he'd tossed down after her was threadbare and crawling with insects. She'd tried everything to escape. She'd searched every inch of the stone walls for weakness, attempted to pry loose the boards above her head, and screamed until her voice gave out. Nothing worked. Harold Montgomery had built this prison well, and he'd made it clear that she would stay here until she agreed to marry the cattle baron from Denver, a man 3 times her age who'd offered a small fortune for a young bride. Her mother had been dead for 2 years now, taken by fever, and with her had gone any semblance of kindness in this house. Harold had never loved Josephine, had only tolerated her presence because her mother had begged him to. Now that she was gone, he saw his stepdaughter as nothing more than a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. Josephine would rather die in this cellar than become the property of another cruel man. But as the hours crawled past and her stomach cramped with hunger, she wondered if she would even have a choice in the matter. The ranch above her continued its daily operations as though nothing were amiss. She could hear the muffled sounds of boots on the floorboards, the occasional voice calling orders to the ranch hands, the distant lowing of cattle being moved from pasture to pasture. No one knew she was down here. Harold had told everyone she'd gone to visit relatives in Denver, a convenient lie that bought him time to break her spirit, and it was working. Josephine could feel herself growing weaker, her thoughts becoming foggy and disjointed. Soon she would be too weak to fight, and then he would have won. But fate had other plans, though Josephine didn't know it yet. Yates Garrison had been riding for 3 weeks straight, following a trail that had grown colder with each passing day. The man he hunted, a horse thief and murderer named Jack Delaney, had vanished somewhere in the San Luis Valley, and Yates was determined to find him. At 24, Yates had already made a name for himself as one of the most reliable bounty hunters in the Colorado Territory. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that curled at his collar and gray eyes that missed nothing. His face was weathered beyond his years from long days in the saddle, and a scar ran along his jaw from a knife fight in Pueblo that had nearly ended his life. He wasn't a cruel man, but he wasn't soft either. Life had taught him to be careful about who he trusted, and he'd learned early that the world was full of people who would take advantage of kindness. Still, he had his own code of honor, a line he wouldn't cross no matter how much money was offered. He didn't hunt innocent people, and he didn't work for men who abused their power. It was a narrow path to walk in a territory where justice was often decided by whoever had the most guns, but Yates had managed so far. Alamosa wasn't much to look at when he rode in that afternoon. The town sat at the base of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a dusty main street. The railroad had come through a few years back, bringing with it a surge of growth, but it was still rough country. Saloons outnumbered churches 3-1, and the cemetery on the edge of town was filling up faster than anyone liked to admit. Yates had been here before, chasing another bounty, and he knew the sheriff was more interested in keeping the peace than enforcing the law. He stopped at the saloon first, hoping someone might have seen Delaney pass through. The bartender, a thick-necked man with suspicious eyes, claimed he hadn't seen anyone matching the description, but Yates caught the way his gaze flickered toward a table in the corner where 3 ranch hands were playing cards. He filed that information away and ordered a whiskey, letting the burn of it wash away some of the dust in his throat. "You looking for work?" one of the ranch hands called out. He was younger than the others, maybe 18 or 19, with the kind of cocky attitude that came from being too green to know better. Yates turned slowly, measuring the young man with a glance. "Depends on the work. Montgomery Ranch is always hiring. Good pay, steady work. Better than chasing ghosts across the territory." The older man beside him, grizzled and scarred, elbowed the younger one hard enough to make him wince. "Shut your mouth, Tommy. We don't need more hands." But Tommy wasn't smart enough to take the hint. "Come on, Bill." Mr. Montgomery said he wanted extra men for the roundup. "This fellow looks like he can handle himself." Yates filed the name away. Montgomery Ranch. It meant nothing to him at the moment, but in a town this small, information was currency. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm just passing through." "Looking for someone." "Bounty hunter." Bill's expression had gone flat and unfriendly. "Sometimes. We don't like bounty hunters much around here. They tend to cause trouble." Yates finished his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate care. "Only trouble I cause is for people who have earned it. I'm looking for Jack Delaney." "Seen him." The name got a reaction, subtle but there. Tommy's eyes widened slightly and Bill's jaw tightened, but it was the third man, silent until now, who spoke. "Delaney rode through about a week ago. Stopped long enough to water his horse and then headed south toward the border." It was a lie, but Yates didn't call him on it. Instead, he nodded his thanks and left the saloon, leading his horse toward the livery stable. As he walked, he became aware of being watched. It was a prickly sensation between his shoulder blades, the kind that came from years of staying alive in dangerous situations. He didn't turn around, didn't give any indication that he'd noticed, but his hand drifted closer to the gun at his hip. The livery stable was run by an ancient Mexican man who spoke more Spanish than English, but they managed to come to an understanding about feed and board for Yates's horse. As the old man led the animal into a stall, Yates asked casually, "You know anything about the Montgomery Ranch?" The old man's face went carefully blank. "Rich man. Many cattle. I know nothing else." It was the same kind of non-answer that Yates had been getting all afternoon, which made him curious. In his experience, people only clammed up like this when there was something worth hiding. He paid for 2 days of stabling and walked back toward the hotel, his mind working through the puzzle pieces. Delaney had been here, that much he was certain of. The question was where he'd gone and why everyone seemed so eager to point Yates in the wrong direction. The hotel was called the Silver Star, though there was nothing silver or star-like about it. The woman at the front desk was in her 50s, with tired eyes and the kind of efficient manner that came from years of asking no questions. Yates paid for a room and carried his saddlebags upstairs, grateful for the promise of a real bed for the first time in weeks. But before he could settle in, he heard raised voices from the street below. He moved to the window and looked down to see a well-dressed man in his 50s climbing down from a fancy carriage. Even from here, Yates could see the man carried himself with the arrogance of someone used to being obeyed. 2 ranch hands flanked him, both armed, and they were having a heated discussion with the sheriff, a portly man whose badge sat crooked on his vest. "I don't care what you think you heard, Sheriff," the well-dressed man was saying, his voice carrying up to Yates's window. That girl is my daughter, and I'll discipline her as I see fit. If she's choosing to sulk in her room instead of taking her meals, that's her concern, not yours." The sheriff looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Now, Harold, you know I'm not trying to interfere in family business. But Mrs. Patterson from the church said she hasn't seen Josephine in over a week, and you know how people talk." Harold Montgomery, because that's clearly who this was, leaned in close to the sheriff, and though Yates couldn't hear what was said, the threat in his posture was unmistakable. The sheriff stepped back, holding up his hands in a placating gesture, and Montgomery climbed back into his carriage and rode off, his ranch hands following on horseback. Yates stayed at the window, watching the sheriff hurry back to his office like a man who wanted to forget the whole conversation. Something wasn't right here, but it wasn't Yates's business. He had a bounty to track, and getting involved in local disputes was a good way to end up dead or delayed. Still, the name Josephine stuck in his mind as he settled onto the bed, trying to catch a few hours of sleep before he resumed his hunt. He dreamed of dark cellars and locked doors, of someone calling for help, and woke before dawn with a restless energy he couldn't quite explain. Josephine had lost track of time. Was it day 4? Day 5? The darkness made it impossible to tell, and her mind kept slipping in and out of awareness like a candle flame guttering in the wind. She'd stopped screaming because her throat was too raw, stopped pounding on the door because her hands were too damaged. Now she simply lay on the dirt floor, the thin blanket pulled around her shoulders, and tried to remember what the sky looked like. She thought about her mother often in these long, dark hours. Margaret Crawford had been a gentle woman, soft-spoken and kind, and she'd tried her best to shield Josephine from Harold's cruelty. But she'd been dying even before the fever took her, worn down by years of a loveless marriage to a man who saw her as little more than a housekeeper and a means to respectability. On her deathbed, she'd made Josephine promise to be strong, to find a way to survive no matter what happened. Josephine had promised, but she was failing. She could feel herself slipping away, her body shutting down from lack of food and water. Harold had been down once since locking her in, pushing a cup of water and a piece of stale bread through a slot in the door. He'd asked if she was ready to be reasonable, ready to accept her duty as a daughter. When she'd refused, he'd laughed and told her she had another week to think about it. If she still wouldn't cooperate, he'd simply tell everyone she'd run off with some drifter, and no one would question it. Women disappeared all the time in the West, and who would care about one more? But Josephine had underestimated how quickly the human body could deteriorate. By the time Harold came back, she might already be past saving. The thought should have frightened her, but instead, she felt a strange peace settling over her. If death was the only way out of this cellar, then perhaps it was a kinder fate than what waited for her above. Yates spent the next day asking careful questions around town, trying to pick up Delaney's trail without alerting anyone who might be protecting him. What he learned instead was that Alamosa was a town living in fear, though no one would say so directly. Harold Montgomery owned half the land in the valley, employed a third of the men in town, and had his fingers in every business from the saloon to the general store. People spoke his name with the kind of careful respect that really meant terror, and more than one person warned Yates that Montgomery didn't take kindly to strangers asking questions. It was the kind of situation Yates normally avoided. Powerful men with private armies were dangerous, and going up against them without cause was a good way to end up in an unmarked grave. But there was something about the way people wouldn't meet his eyes when he asked about Montgomery's stepdaughter, something about the guilty silence that fell whenever her name was mentioned, that made him unable to let it go. He found Mrs. Patterson at the church, a stout woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much sadness. She was arranging flowers on the altar when Yates knocked on the open door, and she turned with a practiced smile that faltered when she saw he was a stranger. "Can I help you, sir?" Yates removed his hat respectfully. "I hope so, madam. I'm looking for information about Josephine Crawford. I understand you were concerned about her welfare." Mrs. Patterson's face went pale, and she glanced toward the door as though expecting Montgomery himself to appear. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice shook. "Madam, I'm not here to cause trouble for you, but if that girl is in danger, someone needs to help her." "And what makes you think she's in danger? Harold Montgomery says she went to Denver. Do you believe him?" The question hung in the air between them. Mrs. Patterson set down the flowers she'd been holding and sank onto one of the pews, her hands trembling. "I've known Josephine since she was a little girl. Her mother was a dear friend of mine before she passed. Josephine is a good, kind young woman who's had nothing but hardship since her mother married that monster." "What kind of hardship?" "The kind a woman doesn't speak of in polite company." Mrs. Patterson's voice was bitter. "Harold never raised a hand to her while Margaret was alive, but after she died, Josephine came to church more than once with bruises she claimed were from falls or accidents. We all knew the truth, but what could we do? The sheriff is in Montgomery's pocket, and no one in this town has the courage to stand up to him." Yates felt a cold anger settling in his gut. "And you think he's done something to her now?" "I know he has. Josephine would never miss Sunday service without telling me. She hasn't been seen in town for over a week, and when I rode out to the ranch to check on her, the foreman turned me away at the gate. Told me Mr. Montgomery didn't appreciate busybodies interfering in his family affairs." She looked up at Yates with desperate eyes. "I tried to get the sheriff to investigate, but you saw how that went." "I saw." "So why do you care? You're just passing through, aren't you? What's Josephine Crawford to you?" It was a fair question, and Yates didn't have a good answer. "Let's just say I don't like men who abuse their power." "Can you draw me a map of the Montgomery ranch?" Mrs. Patterson looked at him for a long moment, weighing something in her mind. Then she stood and moved to the small office at the back of the church, returning with paper and pencil. As she sketched, she spoke quietly. "The main house is here, at the center of the property. The bunkhouse for the ranch hands is about 200 yards to the east, and the barn and stables are here to the west. Montgomery keeps guards posted at night, usually 2 men walking the perimeter. If Josephine is being held somewhere, it would most likely be in the house itself." "Does the house have a cellar?" Mrs. Patterson paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. "Yes, Margaret mentioned it once. She said Harold used it for storing preserves and vegetables, but it always gave her an uneasy feeling. There's only one entrance through a door in the kitchen that leads down a set of stairs. Why? Just thinking." Yates took the map and folded it carefully. "If anyone asks, you never spoke to me." "What are you going to do?" "Something stupid, probably." He tipped his hat to her and left the church, his mind already working through the logistics of what he was planning. Breaking into Montgomery's ranch to search for a woman he'd never met. On the word of a worried church lady and his own gut instinct, was possibly the most reckless thing Yates had ever considered. It went against every rule he'd learned about staying alive in this business. But as he rode back to the hotel to gather his gear, he couldn't shake the image of a young woman locked away in darkness, waiting for help that would never come. If he was wrong, and Josephine Crawford really was in Denver, then he'd simply apologize and leave town. But if he was right, if that girl was trapped somewhere on Montgomery's property, then Yates couldn't walk away. It went against everything he believed in, everything his father had taught him before a bullet had taken him during the war. He waited until full dark before riding out, keeping to the shadows and moving slowly to avoid attention. The Montgomery Ranch was about 5 miles outside of town, a sprawling compound that spoke of wealth and power. Yates left his horse tied to a tree about a half-mile out and approached on foot, moving carefully through the scrub brush and using the darkness as cover. The ranch was quiet, most of the hands already asleep in the bunkhouse. He could see light in the windows of the main house and 2 guards making lazy circuits around the property. But they weren't expecting trouble, and their attention was focused outward, watching for threats from beyond the ranch, not from within. Yates waited until they'd passed his position, and then moved quickly toward the house, pressing himself against the wall and working his way around to the back. The kitchen window was open to let in the cool night air, and Yates could hear someone moving around inside, the clatter of dishes being washed. He waited for the sound to stop, for whoever was working to leave, and then he carefully climbed through the window, landing silently on the wooden floor. The kitchen was large and well-appointed, with a cast-iron stove and shelves lined with preserves and dry goods. And there, set into the floor near the far wall, was a heavy wooden door with a thick bolt drawn across it. Yates moved toward it, his heart pounding in his chest, and pressed his ear against the wood. At first, he heard nothing. Then, so faint he almost missed it, came a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the weak, desperate sob of someone who'd given up hope. Josephine didn't know what made her look up when she heard the scraping sound above her head. She'd been drifting in and out of consciousness, her body too weak to do more than breathe. But something about that sound cut through the fog in her mind, and she forced her eyes open, staring up at the cellar door. The bolt was sliding back. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating, that her mind had finally broken under the strain and was showing her impossible things. But then the door swung open and lamplight flooded down the stairs, and a figure appeared silhouetted against the glow. "Is someone down there?" The voice was male, deep and careful, nothing like her stepfather's cruel bark. Josephine tried to answer, but her throat was too dry. All that came out was a rasping croak. The figure descended the stairs quickly, and as he came closer, Josephine could make out details. He was tall and lean, wearing the clothes of a working man with a gun at his hip and a face that was both hard and kind. When he saw her lying on the floor, his expression transformed into fury. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. "What did he do to you, please?" Josephine managed to whisper. "Water." The man didn't hesitate. He pulled a canteen from his belt and lifted her head gently, helping her take small sips. The water was the most beautiful thing she'd ever tasted, cool and clean, and she wanted to gulp it down, but he controlled the flow, making sure she didn't drink too fast. "Easy now. Not too much at once or you'll be sick." His voice was steady, calming, and Josephine found herself focusing on it, using it as an anchor to pull herself back from the edge of darkness. "My name is Yates Garrison. I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to tell me if you can walk." Josephine tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't support her weight. She collapsed back onto the dirt floor, frustrated tears burning in her eyes. "I do not think so. How long have I been down here?" "I don't know, but it doesn't matter. I'll carry you." Yates set down the canteen and carefully gathered her into his arms, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. Josephine's head lolled against his chest, and she could hear the steady beat of his heart, strong and sure. "Hold on to me if you can." She managed to hook one arm weakly around his neck, and then they were moving up the stairs, out of the cellar that had been her prison. The lamplight of the kitchen made her eyes water after so long in darkness, but she didn't care. She was free. This stranger, this man named Yates, had broken down the door and set her free. They were halfway across the kitchen when a door slammed open and Harold Montgomery stood there, his face purple with rage. "What in the hell do you think you are doing?" Yates didn't stop moving. "Getting this woman to a doctor. That woman is my daughter, and I'll thank you to put her down before I have you shot for trespassing. She's not your daughter, she's your stepdaughter, and from the looks of things, you've been trying to kill her." Yates's voice was cold, dangerous. "Now you can get out of my way, or you can try to stop me. But I should warn you, I'm not in a patient mood." Harold's hand moved toward the gun at his belt, but Yates was faster. In a blur of motion, he had his own revolver out and pointed at Harold's head, all while keeping Josephine secure in his other arm. "Don't." The word was flat, final. Harold froze, his eyes calculating. "You have no idea what you are getting yourself into, boy. I own this town. I own the sheriff. By tomorrow morning, there will be a warrant out for your arrest, and you will be hunted like a dog. Then I guess I better ride fast." Yates backed toward the kitchen window, keeping his gun trained on Harold. "If you come after me, if you send your men after me, I will make sure everyone in the territory knows what you did to this girl. And I don't think your reputation can survive that kind of scandal. Who's going to believe a drifter and a hysterical woman over me? Maybe no one. But I know a few newspaper men in Denver who'd love a story about a wealthy rancher who locks his stepdaughter in a cellar to force her into marriage. They might not print it, but the rumor alone would ruin you." Yates reached the window and carefully climbed through, still holding Josephine. "Stay away from us, Montgomery. This is your only warning." Then they were outside, moving quickly through the darkness. Josephine heard shouting behind them, heard Harold calling for his men, but Yates was running now, his long legs eating up the distance. She bounced against his chest, each impact sending jolts of pain through her weakened body, but she bit her lip and stayed silent. This man was risking his life for her, and she wouldn't slow him down with complaints. They reached the horse, and Yates lifted her into the saddle before swinging up behind her. His arm came around her waist, holding her secure against him, and then they were galloping into the night. Josephine heard the crack of gunfire behind them, heard bullets whizzing through the air. But Yates kept riding, pushing the horse hard toward the mountains. They rode for what felt like hours but was probably only one, moving fast and avoiding the main trail. Yates seemed to know where he was going, guiding the horse through rough country with confidence. Finally, when they were miles from the ranch and the sounds of pursuit had faded, he slowed the horse to a walk and looked down at the woman he'd rescued. "How are you holding up?" Josephine realized she was shaking, though whether from cold or shock or relief she couldn't say. "I am alive. That is more than I expected when I woke up this morning." "Yeah, well, you look half dead. We need to get you to a doctor." "Not in a limosa. My stepfather will have men watching." "I know. We are heading to Fort Garland. It is about 25 miles north, and they have an army doctor stationed there. Can you make it that far?" Josephine didn't know, but she nodded anyway. She'd already decided that she would rather die trying to escape than go back to that cellar. "Why did you help me? You do not even know me." Yates was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "I heard you were missing. I heard your stepfather was lying about where you were, and I've seen enough bad men in my life to know one when I meet him. Sometimes you just have to do what's right, even if it's not smart. That is the kindest thing anyone has done for me since my mother died. Then you have been around the wrong people." They rode through the night, and Josephine drifted in and out of awareness, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the warmth of Yates's body behind her. She'd never been this close to a man before, certainly not one who wasn't trying to hurt her. It felt strange and intimate and somehow safe. and she found herself relaxing against him, trusting him to keep her from falling. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, Yates finally stopped to let the horse rest and to check on Josephine. He helped her down from the saddle, and she immediately collapsed, her legs refusing to support her. Yates caught her before she hit the ground and carried her to a flat rock, setting her down gently. "You need food," he said, digging through his saddlebags. He came up with some dried beef and hardtack, and though it was rough fare, Josephine ate it gratefully, washing it down with more water from his canteen. As she ate, she studied him in the growing light. Yates Garrison was handsome in a rough, weathered way. His face was lean and angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw marked by that scar. His eyes were gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held an intelligence and a wariness that spoke of hard lessons learned. His dark hair was too long, curling over his collar, and he needed a shave, but there was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that made her feel safe. "What were you doing at my stepfather's ranch?" she asked between bites. "How did you know where to find me?" "I was passing through town, tracking a bounty. But I heard people talking, heard the concern about you going missing. A woman from the church, Mrs. Patterson, she gave me the information I needed. Mrs. Patterson, I should have known she would not give up on me." Josephine felt tears pricking her eyes, though whether from gratitude or exhaustion, she couldn't say. "My stepfather was trying to force me to marry a cattle baron from Denver, a horrible man, old and cruel. When I refused, he locked me in that cellar and said he would keep me there until I agreed. I thought I was going to die down there." Yates's expression hardened. "He's lucky I didn't shoot him." "Why did you not?" "Because I was more worried about getting you out alive than I was about revenge. Besides, a man like that, shooting's too quick. Better to let him suffer with knowing he failed to break you." They rested for another hour, letting the horse graze and drink from a small stream. Yates found a blanket in his saddle roll and wrapped it around Josephine's shoulders, and she huddled into it gratefully. The morning air was cold, and she'd lost so much body heat during her imprisonment that she couldn't seem to get warm. As they sat there, Josephine found herself studying Yates again, trying to understand this man who'd risked everything for a stranger. "You said you were tracking a bounty." "Won't helping me interfere with that, probably, but some things are more important than money. I cannot pay you for rescuing me. I have nothing." Yates looked at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I'm not asking for payment. I'm asking you to stay alive long enough to get to that fort." They mounted up again as the sun crested the mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and pink. Josephine felt stronger after the food and rest, though she was still weak enough that Yates had to help her into the saddle. They rode north, following trails that only someone familiar with the country would know, and Yates kept a constant watch behind them, looking for signs of pursuit. "You think he will send men after us?" Josephine asked. "Yes, but he will have to be careful about it. If he sends too many men, people will wonder why, and if I'm right about him, he is more concerned with protecting his reputation than he is with getting you back. He wanted the money from selling me to that cattle baron. There will be other opportunities for him. He is a rich man, and rich men always find ways to get richer." Yates paused. "But you need to understand something. Once we get to Fort Garland, once you tell the army what happened, Montgomery will do everything in his power to discredit you. He will call you a liar, will say you ran off with a bounty hunter and made up wild stories to cover your shame. It is going to get ugly. I do not care. I am not going back to him, no matter what he says or does. Good, because you are going to need that strength." They reached Fort Garland by mid-afternoon, and the sight of the American flag flying over the wooden stockade walls made Josephine want to weep with relief. Yates rode straight to the main gate, and when the soldier on duty tried to stop them, he explained the situation quickly and firmly. Within minutes, they were inside the fort, and a gray-haired army doctor was examining Josephine while Yates spoke with the commanding officer. The doctor, whose name was Captain Morrison, was thorough and professional. He checked Josephine's pulse, examined her hands and throat, and asked her a series of questions about her ordeal. When he was finished, he looked at her with compassion and anger. "Young lady, you are severely dehydrated and malnourished. You have bruising consistent with physical abuse, and your hands show signs of trauma from trying to escape your confinement. I'm going to keep you here for a few days to make sure you recover fully, and I'm going to document everything I've found. If this matter goes to trial, my testimony will be invaluable. Thank you, doctor. Don't thank me. Thank that young man out there. If he'd found you even a day later, I'm not sure you would have survived." Josephine was given a clean bed in the fort's small infirmary, and for the first time in over a week, she felt safe enough to truly sleep. But before she closed her eyes, she asked the doctor to send Yates in to see her. He came a few minutes later, his hat in his hands and his expression uncertain. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Dr. Morrison says I will recover fully thanks to you." Josephine reached out her bandaged hand, and after a moment, Yates took it carefully. "I do not even know what to say." "You saved my life, Yates Garrison. How can I ever repay that?" "You don't need to repay anything. I'm just glad I got there in time." He paused, looking down at their joined hands. "I spoke with the commanding officer. He is going to send a patrol to Alamosa to investigate your stepfather. It might not amount to much, but at least there will be an official record of what happened." "And what will you do now?" "I need to get back to tracking Delaney. That bounty is worth $500, and I've already lost too much time." Josephine felt something twist in her chest at the thought of him leaving. This man, this stranger who'd appeared like something out of a dream and rescued her from a nightmare, was just going to ride away and disappear from her life. It shouldn't matter. She barely knew him. But somehow it did matter, more than she wanted to admit. "Will I see you again?" Yates looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something flicker in his gray eyes, something that might have been regret or longing or both. "I don't know. I don't exactly have a home to come back to. I go where the work takes me. That sounds like a lonely life. It is what it is." He squeezed her hand gently and then let go, stepping back. "You take care of yourself, Josephine Crawford, and don't let anyone make you feel small ever again. You are stronger than you know." Then he was gone, and Josephine was left alone with the ache of his absence and the confused tangle of emotions in her chest. She spent 3 days recovering at Fort Garland, eating regular meals and regaining her strength under Dr. Morrison's watchful eye. The commanding officer, Colonel Whitmore, interviewed her at length about her ordeal, and he promised that he would make sure the territorial authorities were informed of Harold Montgomery's crimes. But he was also honest with her about the challenges she would face. "Your stepfather is a powerful man with deep pockets and political connections," Colonel Whitmore said. "Even with Dr. Morrison's testimony and the evidence of your condition, it will be difficult to bring charges against him. The justice system in the territories is imperfect at best and corrupt at worst. So he will get away with what he did to me. I didn't say that. I said it will be difficult. But you have something he didn't count on. You have witnesses willing to speak on your behalf, and you have the army support. That counts for something." Josephine wanted to believe him, but she'd seen too much of how the world worked to be naive. Men like Harold Montgomery didn't face consequences for their actions, especially not when their victims were women with no money or power. Still, she thanked the colonel for his help and tried to focus on getting better. On the 4th day, She was strong enough to leave the infirmary, and Mrs. Patterson arrived from a limosa with a wagon and a trunk full of Josephine's belongings. The older woman had tears streaming down her face as she hugged Josephine tightly. "Thank God you are alive. Thank God that young man found you in time. Did you see Yates before he left?" "I did. He came by the church to let me know you were safe. I tried to give him money to thank him, but he refused, said he was just doing what anyone decent would do." Mrs. Patterson pulled back to look at Josephine's face. "He cares about you, you know. I could see it in his eyes when he talked about you." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "He barely knows me." Sometimes that is all it takes. A moment of connection, a shared experience. "I've seen strong bonds form over less." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "But enough about that for now. We need to figure out what you are going to do. You cannot stay in a limosa, not with your stepfather still there." "I know. I was thinking of going to Denver, maybe finding work as a seamstress or a teacher." "That is a possibility, but I have another idea. My sister runs a boarding house in Colorado Springs. She has been looking for someone to help manage it, and I think you would be perfect for the job. It would give you a place to live and a steady income, and Colorado Springs is far enough from El Mimosa that your stepfather's reach wouldn't extend there." It was a generous offer, and Josephine accepted it gratefully. Within a week, she was on a stagecoach heading east, leaving behind the town where she'd suffered so much and carrying with her the memory of a gray-eyed bounty hunter who'd risked everything to save her. Colorado Springs was a revelation. The town sat at the base of Pikes Peak, a growing community of merchants and businessmen drawn by the railroad and the promise of prosperity. Mrs. Patterson's sister, a formidable woman named Charlotte Brennan, ran a respectable boarding house near the center of town, catering to traveling salesmen and railroad workers. She put Josephine to work immediately, teaching her how to manage the books, prepare meals for a dozen hungry men, and maintain order in a house full of transient residents. The work was hard, but Josephine thrived on it. For the first time in her life, she had independence and purpose. She had money of her own, earned by her own labor, and no one could take it from her. She made friends with the other women in town, attended church on Sundays, and slowly began to build a life for herself. But through it all, she couldn't stop thinking about Yates Garrison. She wondered where he was, whether he'd caught his bounty, whether he ever thought about the woman he'd rescued from a dark cellar. Sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would replay their brief time together in her mind, remembering the gentle way he'd held her, the fierce protectiveness in his voice when he'd confronted her stepfather, the warmth of his body behind her as they'd ridden through the night. She told herself it was foolish to dwell on a man she'd known for less than a day, a man who'd made it clear he had no ties and no plans to settle down. But the heart didn't always listen to reason, and Josephine couldn't deny that something had shifted in her during those desperate hours. Yates had seen her at her weakest and most vulnerable, and he hadn't pitied her or treated her as broken. He'd treated her as someone worth saving, worth fighting for, and that had changed something fundamental in how she saw herself. 3 months passed. Summer gave way to autumn, and the aspens on the mountainsides turned gold and orange. Josephine had settled into her new life, had even begun to think about her future beyond the boarding house. Charlotte had mentioned that a schoolteacher position was opening up in town, and with Josephine's education and intelligence, she would be a strong candidate for it. Then, on a crisp October morning, Josephine was hanging laundry in the backyard when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the street out front. She thought nothing of it at first. Riders came and went all the time in a town like this, but something made her pause, made her set down the wet sheet she'd been hanging and walk around to the front of the house. A tall man was dismounting from a tired-looking horse, his movements stiff and careful as though he was injured or exhausted. He wore dusty clothes and a battered hat, and there was something familiar about the set of his shoulders, the way he moved. Josephine's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. "Yates!" He turned at the sound of her voice, and even from across the yard she could see the smile that spread across his face. "Hello, Josephine." She didn't remember deciding to run to him, didn't remember crossing the distance between them, but suddenly she was there, and he was catching her in his arms, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "What are you doing here?" Josephine finally managed to ask, pulling back just enough to look at his face. He looked thinner than she remembered, and there was a new scar above his eyebrow, but his gray eyes were warm and full of something that made her breath catch. "I finished my job. Caught Delaney near the New Mexico border and collected my bounty. And then I realized I didn't know where to go next, because the only place I wanted to be was wherever you were." He cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I went back to Fort Garland and tracked you down. Took me a while, but I'm persistent." "You came all this way just to see me." "I came all this way because I couldn't stop thinking about you, because every town I rode through felt empty without you in it. Because somewhere between breaking down that cellar door and riding away from Fort Garland, I fell in love with you, Josephine Crawford, and I needed to know if you felt the same way." Josephine's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. This was everything she'd dreamed about during those long, lonely nights, but she'd never believed it could actually happen. Men like Yates Garrison didn't fall in love with damaged women they'd rescued. Except apparently this one had. "I do," she whispered. "I feel the same way. I have since the moment you carried me out of that darkness." Yates's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds, bright and warm and full of joy. Then he was kissing her, and Josephine was kissing him back, and the world around them seemed to fade away until there was nothing but the two of them and the promise of a future together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning like fools, Josephine realized they had an audience. Charlotte Brennan was standing on the front porch with her arms crossed and a knowing smile on her face, and several of the boarding house residents were watching from windows with varying degrees of amusement. "I suppose you should come inside and have some coffee," Josephine said, feeling her cheeks burn. "And then you can tell me everything that happened after you left Fort Garland." They sat in the boarding house kitchen while Josephine poured coffee and listened to Yates's story. He'd tracked Delaney for 2 more weeks, finally cornering him in a saloon in Santa Fe. There'd been a fight, hence the new scar, but Yates had prevailed and collected his bounty. Then, instead of looking for his next job, he'd found himself thinking about a young woman with dark hair and brave eyes, wondering if she'd made it to safety, wondering if she ever thought about him. "I told myself I was being foolish," Yates said, cradling his coffee cup in his hands. "I told myself you'd moved on with your life and wouldn't want some drifter showing up on your doorstep, but I couldn't let it go. I had to know. I'm glad you came. I've thought about you every single day since you left. So what do we do now?" Yates asked, and there was vulnerability in his voice that made Josephine's heart ache. "I'm not good at this, at relationships and settling down. I've spent most of my adult life on the move, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots, but I want to try. For you, I want to try." Josephine reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. "I do not need you to be something you are not. I fell in love with a bounty hunter who rides from town to town, but maybe we can find a way to make it work." Maybe you can make Colorado Springs your home base, the place you come back to between jobs. And maybe, eventually, you will decide you are ready to hang up your guns and stay for good. You'd wait for me, even knowing I might be gone for weeks or months at a time. I waited my whole life for someone like you, Yates Garrison. I think I can wait a little longer. They talked for hours that day, mapping out the possibilities of a future together. Yates admitted he had money saved from his bounty hunting work, enough to buy a small house or a piece of land. Josephine told him about the schoolteacher position, about her dreams of making a difference in children's lives. They talked about the practical realities of building a life together, about the challenges they would face, and about the hope that burned bright between them. As the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Yates walked Josephine to the edge of town where they could see Pikes Peak rising against the horizon. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest, feeling safe and cherished in a way she'd never experienced before. "I have to tell you something," Yates said quietly. "When I found you in that cellar, when I saw what your stepfather had done to you, I felt something shift inside me. I've seen a lot of cruelty in this world, done things I am not proud of, but in that moment, I knew I wanted to be better. I wanted to be the kind of man who protects people instead of just hunting them. You made me want to be better." Josephine turned in his arms, looking up at his face. "You were already that man, Yates. You just needed a reason to see it yourself." He kissed her again, tender and sweet, and Josephine felt the last of her fears melting away. She'd been through hell, had survived things that would have broken weaker people, but she'd come out the other side stronger. And now she had this beautiful, unexpected love with a man who saw her as she truly was and loved her anyway. Over the next few months, Yates made good on his promise. He bought a small house on the edge of Colorado Springs, a modest 2-bedroom with a view of the mountains and enough land for a garden. When he had to leave for bounty hunting work, Josephine stayed busy with her job at the boarding house and her preparations for the schoolteacher position she'd been offered. And when he came home, dusty and tired but always with that bright smile when he saw her, they would spend their evenings talking and planning and falling deeper in love. In December, 6 months after he'd first ridden into Colorado Springs, Yates proposed. It wasn't a grand gesture, no elaborate planning or expensive ring. They were sitting by the fireplace in their small house, Josephine reading a book and Yates cleaning his guns, when he suddenly set down his revolver and turned to her. "Marry me." Josephine looked up from her book, startled. "What? Marry me, Josephine. I know I am not much of a catch. I am gone more than I am home. I am dangerous work for dangerous pay, and I have more enemies than friends. But I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this world, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Josephine set down her book slowly, her heart racing. "Yates Garrison, that is the worst proposal I have ever heard." His face fell, and she saw genuine pain flash through his eyes before she laughed and launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Yes, you foolish man. Yes, I will marry you. But next time you propose to someone, maybe lead with the love part instead of listing all your flaws." They were married in January of 1879, in a small ceremony at the Colorado Springs Church with Mrs. Patterson and Charlotte Brennan as witnesses. Josephine wore a simple blue dress that she'd sewn herself, and Yates wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Colonel Whitmore came down from Fort Garland to attend, and even Dr. Morrison made the trip, both men delighted to see the happy ending to a story that had started so dark. There was no word from Harold Montgomery, though Josephine learned through Mrs. Patterson that he'd left Alamosa shortly after the Army investigation had begun. His ranch had been sold to pay debts, and rumor had it he'd moved to California, where no one knew his name or his crimes. Josephine felt nothing about his departure, no triumph or satisfaction or even relief. He was simply gone from her life, a chapter closed, and she had no desire to ever think about him again. The first year of marriage was an adjustment. Yates tried to take shorter jobs, ones that kept him closer to home, but bounty hunting was unpredictable work. Sometimes he'd be gone for 2 weeks, sometimes 2 months. Josephine filled the lonely hours with her teaching work, pouring her energy into educating the children of Colorado Springs and finding deep satisfaction in watching them learn and grow. But when Yates was home, it was magic. They would stay up late talking about everything and nothing, would ride out into the mountains together on his days off, would make love with a passion and tenderness that left Josephine breathless and amazed. She'd never known it was possible to be this happy, to feel this complete. Yates had saved her life, but in doing so, he'd given her something even more precious. He'd given her a reason to truly live. In the spring of 1880, Josephine realized she was pregnant. She told Yates on a Sunday morning, watching his face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he just stared at her, his gray eyes wide with shock. Then he whooped with joy and picked her up, spinning her around the kitchen until she was dizzy and laughing. "We are going to be parents," he said, his voice full of wonder. "I am going to be a father. Are you happy about it?" "Happy? Josephine, I am terrified and thrilled and so deeply in love with you that I can barely breathe. Yes, I am happy about it." The pregnancy changed things. Yates took fewer jobs, stayed closer to home, and began seriously considering hanging up his guns permanently. They talked about what he might do instead, and he admitted he'd always been good with horses. Maybe he could start a breeding operation, training horses for the cavalry or for ranchers. It would be steady work, honest work, and it would keep him home with his family. Their son was born in November, a healthy baby boy with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Thomas, after Yates's father who died during the war. And from the moment Yates held his son for the first time, Josephine knew his bounty hunting days were over. She could see it in his face, the fierce protectiveness and overwhelming love that transformed him completely. "I'm done," he said that night, sitting by Josephine's bedside while she recovered. Thomas was asleep in her arms, tiny and perfect, and Yates was watching them both with an expression of pure devotion. "I am not risking leaving you and this boy alone. I am staying home. Are you sure? I do not want you to resent me for making you give up your work." "You are not making me do anything. I am choosing this, choosing you and Thomas over everything else. Besides, I think I will make a pretty good horse trainer, do not you?" he did. Over the next year, Yates built a small but successful business training horses, earning a reputation for his skill and patience with even the most difficult animals. The work was hard and the pay was modest compared to bounty hunting, but he came home every night to his wife and son, and that was worth more than all the bounties in the territory. Josephine continued teaching until Thomas was born, then took a year off to care for him before returning to the schoolhouse part-time. She loved being a mother, loved watching her son grow and learn and discover the world. And she loved seeing Yates as a father, patient and playful and absolutely devoted to his boy. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Josephine's mother, was born in 1882. She had Josephine's dark eyes and Yates's stubborn streak, and from the moment she could walk, she was following her father around the horse corrals, demanding to help with everything. Yates taught both children to ride almost as soon as they could walk, and by the time Thomas was 5 and Margaret was 3, they were galloping around the property like miniature cavalry officers. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Yates's horse training business grew, and they were able to add on to their small house, building extra bedrooms and a proper dining room. Josephine eventually became the head teacher at the Colorado Springs School, earning respect from the community for her dedication and skill. They made friends, built a life, created a home filled with love and laughter. In 1885, when Thomas was 5 and Margaret was 3, they had their third child, another boy they named William. He was quieter than his siblings, more thoughtful and observant, and Josephine saw echoes of herself in him. Where Thomas was adventurous and Margaret was bold, William was careful and considerate, the kind of child who noticed when others were hurting and tried to help. The years passed in a blur of school recitals and horse training and family dinners, of birthdays and holidays and lazy summer evenings watching the children play in the yard. Josephine would sometimes stop in the middle of her day, overwhelmed by gratitude for the life she'd built. She would think back to that dark cellar, to the girl she'd been then, broken and hopeless, and marvel at how far she'd come. And every night, when she and Yates lay together in their bed, his arm around her waist and her head on his chest, she would silently thank whatever fate or providence had brought him to her. He'd broken down a door and set her free, but he'd given her so much more than that. He'd given her love and safety and a family of her own. He'd given her a future worth living. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised her with a trip back to Fort Garland. Colonel Whitmore had retired, but Dr. Morrison was still there, older and grayer but still sharp. They had dinner with him at the fort, and he listened with delight as Josephine and Yates told him about their 3 children and their life in Colorado Springs. "You know," Dr. Morrison said as the evening was winding down, "when I first examined you, Josephine, I wasn't sure you would survive. You were in bad shape, physically and mentally, but you had a strength in you, a will to live that impressed me. And you, Yates, you had a determination to save her that went beyond duty or obligation. I knew then that if you two found your way to each other, it would be something special." "We were lucky," Josephine said, reaching for Yates's hand across the table. "No," Dr. Morrison disagreed. "Luck is finding a dollar in the street. What you two have, that is choice. You chose to save her, Yates, when it would have been easier to walk away. And you chose to trust him, Josephine, when you had every reason to fear men. You chose each other every day in 1,000 small ways. That is not luck, that is love." They rode home the next day, talking about the doctor's words and about how strange and wonderful it was that such darkness had led to such light. Josephine thought about the girl she'd been in that cellar, about how she'd given up hope, about how she'd been ready to die. If she could go back and tell that girl that help was coming, that a gray-eyed cowboy would break down the door and carry her into a future full of joy and love and family, would she have believed it? Probably not. But it had happened anyway, and that was the miracle. As the years continued to pass, their children grew. Thomas became a skilled horseman like his father, eventually taking over much of the training business. Margaret, true to her bold nature, announced at 15 that she wanted to be a doctor, and despite the raised eyebrows from the community, Josephine and Yates supported her dream wholeheartedly. William followed his mother's path, becoming a teacher and earning a reputation for his patience and kindness with his students. In 1895, when Josephine was 37 and Yates was 41, they became grandparents for the first time. Thomas had married a sweet girl from Denver, and they had a son they named Yates, after his grandfather. Holding that tiny baby in her arms, seeing the joy on her son's face and the pride on her husband's, Josephine felt a completeness that defied description. They were sitting on their porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, when Yates suddenly took her hand and said, "Do you ever think about how different things could have been? If I hadn't been in a limosa that day, if I hadn't heard about you being missing, if I hadn't decided to investigate." Josephine squeezed his hand, feeling the familiar roughness of his palm, the strength that had never wavered in all their years together. "I try not to think about it. It's too frightening to imagine. I think about it sometimes. I think about how close I came to riding right past your life without ever knowing you existed. And then I think about how grateful I am that I didn't. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Josephine Garrison. You and our children and this life we built together. You saved me, Yates. You broke down that door and set me free." "No," he said, turning to look at her with those gray eyes that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. "We saved each other. I was just as trapped as you were, just in a different kind of prison. I was locked in a life of violence and loneliness, never staying anywhere long enough to matter, never letting anyone close enough to hurt me. You set me free just as much as I set you free. We rescued each other." Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. She thought about that night 17 years ago, when a stranger had appeared in the darkness and offered her hope. She thought about all the days and nights since then, all the challenges they'd faced and overcome together. She thought about their children and their grandchildren, about the legacy of love they were building. "Tell me we'll grow old together," she whispered. "Tell me we will have many more years like this." "As many as God grants us," Yates promised. "And I will spend every single one of them loving you, Josephine. From that first moment I heard you crying in that cellar until my last breath. You are the only woman I will ever love." They sat there until the stars filled the sky. Two people who'd found each other in the darkness and built a life in the light. Behind them, their house glowed warm and welcoming, filled with the evidence of a life well lived. Photographs on the walls, children's drawings, books and saddles, and the comfortable clutter of a home filled with love. In the years that followed, they would face more challenges. Margaret would struggle to find a medical school that would accept a woman student, but eventually succeed and become one of the first female doctors in Colorado. William would marry and have 4 children of his own, all of whom would become teachers like their father and grandmother. Thomas would expand the horse training business into one of the most successful in the territory, earning a reputation that brought clients from as far away as Texas and Montana. And through it all, Josephine and Yates would be there, the foundation upon which their family was built. They would grow old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies growing stiff and tired, but their love never dimming. They would sit on that same porch, holding hands and watching sunsets, and remember the night that changed everything. When Yates died in 1910 at the age of 56, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Josephine lying beside him. She woke to find him gone, his face peaceful and his hand still holding hers, and though her heart broke, she felt grateful that they'd had so many years together. He'd given her 31 years of love and devotion, had fathered her children and been the kind of husband she'd never dared to dream existed. She lived another 15 years after that, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She continued teaching until she was 70, inspiring generations of students with her passion and dedication. And every night before she went to sleep, she would touch the photograph on her nightstand, the one of her and Yates on their wedding day, and whisper, "Thank you for breaking down that door. Thank you for setting me free." When Josephine died in 1925, at the age of 67, She was buried beside Yates in the Colorado Springs Cemetery, under a headstone that reads simply, "Together Forever." Their children and grandchildren gathered around the grave, sharing stories about the remarkable couple who'd built such a beautiful legacy. They talked about Yates's bravery and Josephine's strength, about the love that had sustained them through decades of life. But what none of them knew, what Josephine had never told anyone except Yates, was that sometimes in her dreams she was back in that dark cellar, trapped and hopeless. And in those dreams, she would hear the sound of footsteps above her head, hear the bolts sliding back and see light flooding down the stairs. And Yates would be there, young and strong and determined, reaching down to pull her up into safety and love. Even in death, he was still saving her. Even in the darkness, his light still shone. Their story became something of a legend in Colorado Springs, passed down through generations of their family. The tale of the bounty hunter who'd rescued a woman from a cellar and fallen in love with her, of the couple who'd built an empire of love and family from such dark beginnings, inspired countless others. It reminded people that hope could be found in the darkest places, that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, that one person's courage could change the course of another person's life. Years after both Josephine and Yates were gone, their great-great-granddaughter would stand in front of the old house, now a historical landmark, and tell tourists the story. She would point to the porch where they'd sat watching sunsets, to the corrals where Yates had trained horses, to the room where Josephine had taught her children to read. And she would end the story the same way every time. "My great-great-grandfather used to say that he'd been looking for a dangerous man when he found the love of his life instead. And my great-great-grandmother used to say that she'd been waiting to die when life finally found her." They were two broken people who made each other whole, and their love created something beautiful that still echoes through our family today. Every time one of us stands up for someone who cannot stand up for themselves, every time we choose compassion over cruelty, every time we love fearlessly and completely, we honor their memory. They taught us that it only takes one person with courage to change everything, that darkness cannot stand against someone determined to bring light. And in the cemetery on the hill, under the shade of an old cottonwood tree, two headstones stood side by side, marking the final resting place of Yates Garrison and Josephine Crawford Garrison. The inscriptions were simple, just names and dates, but carved at the bottom of each stone was the same phrase: freedom, love, forever. Because that was what they'd given each other and what they'd built together. Freedom from the prisons that had held them, whether physical or emotional. Love that had sustained them through 3 decades of marriage and continued beyond death. And forever, the promise that what they'd created together would never truly die as long as their family remembered the story of how a cowboy broke down a cellar door and set a woman free, and in doing so, freed himself. The Wild West was a hard place, full of violence and injustice and suffering. But it was also a place where extraordinary things could happen, where a single act of courage could ripple out across generations. Josephine and Yates had lived through that era, had survived its cruelties, and celebrated its possibilities. They'd raised children who became good, kind, successful adults. They'd built a business that served their community. They'd loved each other with a depth and constancy that most people only dream about, and it had all started with a scream in the darkness and a stranger who'd refused to walk away. That was their legacy. That was their gift to the world. The knowledge that even in the darkest cellar, hope could find a way in, that even the most broken soul could be healed by love, that courage and compassion and determination could overcome any obstacle. Their story ended, as all stories must, with death. But it also ended with life, with the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their blood and their values forward into the future. It ended with a family that knew where they came from, who understood the sacrifices and struggles that had given them the comfortable lives they enjoyed. And every year, on the anniversary of the day Yates broke down that cellar door, the Garrison family would gather at the old house in Colorado Springs. They would share a meal on the porch, would tell the story again for the youngest members who were hearing it for the first time, would raise their glasses in a toast to the brave cowboy and the resilient woman who'd started it all. To Yates and Josephine, they would say, "May we love as fiercely, live as bravely, and remember always that one person can make all the difference." And somewhere, in whatever place souls go after this life is done, Yates and Josephine Garrison would smile, their hands clasped together as they'd been for so many years, grateful for the life they'd built and the love that had made it all possible. They'd started with nothing but darkness and despair, but they'd created something luminous and enduring. They'd proved that love could conquer fear, that courage could overcome cruelty, that two broken people could heal each other and build something beautiful from the wreckage of their pasts. That was the true end of their story, not with death, but with the continuation of love across generations, with the family they'd created, and the values they'd instilled carrying forward long after they were gone. The cowboy had broken down the door and set the woman free, and together they'd built a legacy that would last forever, a testament to the transformative power of love and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. Their names would be remembered, their story would be told, and the love they'd shared would echo through time, inspiring others to be brave, to be kind, to reach out a hand to those trapped in darkness and show them the way to light. Because that was what Yates Garrison had done for Josephine Crawford on a desperate night in 1878, and it had changed everything, not just for them, but for all the lives they touched and all the generations that followed. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift they could have given, the knowledge that love endures, that hope prevails, and that even in the darkest cellar, freedom is just a broken door away.